This is unacceptable. I donate millions to this hospital and this is what I see at the entrance. Employees sleeping on the job. The voice echoed through the sterile lobby of Minneapolis General Hospital, cutting through the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and distant medical equipment. Richard Sterling, a 50-year-old man in a $5,000 tailored suit, stormed through the automatic doors, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor with each furious step. Snow was falling heavily outside, coating the city in a blanket of white that seemed almost peaceful compared to the storm brewing inside the hospital's main entrance. Richard's face was flushed red with anger as he barked into his phone, gesturing wildly with his free hand. His eyes locked onto a figure slumped on one of the waiting room benches, and his fury intensified. There, sitting against the cold wall with his head tilted back and eyes closed, was Alex, a 30-year-old ICU nurse whose light blue scrubs were wrinkled and stained. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes like bruises, and his face was pale, almost ghostly in the harsh hospital lighting. His breathing was slow and deep, the kind of exhausted sleep that comes after pushing the human body far beyond its natural limits. Richard ended his phone call with a sharp jab at the screen and marched toward the sleeping nurse, his jaw clenched so tight it could crack diamonds. "You!" Richard shouted, kicking the leg of the bench hard enough to make it screech against the floor. Alex jolted awake, his body jerking forward as confusion flooded his exhausted features. He blinked rapidly, trying to focus his bloodshot eyes, one hand instinctively reaching up to wipe the corner of his mouth. "What? I'm sorry, I just closed my eyes for a minute," Alex mumbled, his voice hoarse and cracked from dehydration and fatigue. His words were slow, his brain struggling to catch up with the sudden awakening. "A minute." Richard's voice dripped with contempt as he stepped closer, looming over the disoriented nurse. "You're drooling in my lobby. Do you have any idea who I am? I'm Richard Sterling. My name is on a plaque outside this building. And you," he leaned down to read the ID badge clipped to Alex's scrubs. "Alex, you're fired. Effective immediately." Alex's eyes widened slightly, though he seemed too exhausted to fully process the words being hurled at him. He tried to sit up straighter, wincing as his stiff muscles protested the movement. "Sir, please, I just came from the ICU. It was a really difficult night and I just needed to rest before driving home. I didn't mean to fall asleep here, I was just so tired and dizzy," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to hear your excuses," Richard snapped, cutting him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "I don't pay for difficult, I pay for excellence. I pay for professionals who know how to do their jobs without passing out in public spaces like some kind of homeless vagrant. Security." He called out, his voice booming through the lobby. "Get this lazy piece of garbage out of my hospital right now." Two security guards appeared within moments, looking uncomfortable as they approached Alex. The nurse didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't even seem to have the energy to defend himself. He simply stood up slowly, swaying slightly on his feet, and allowed the guards to escort him toward the exit. As they walked past Richard, Alex glanced back at the elevators, his lips moving in a barely audible whisper that the millionaire didn't catch. "I hope the boy's going to be okay," he said to himself before disappearing through the doors into the freezing Minneapolis night. Richard straightened his tie, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction at having dealt with what he perceived as incompetence. He had always believed that his substantial donations to the hospital gave him the right, even the duty, to maintain standards. After all, excellence wasn't something you could compromise on, especially not in healthcare. He strode to the elevator bank, pressed the button for the pediatric intensive care unit, and rode up in silence, adjusting his cufflinks and checking his reflection in the polished metal doors. The atmosphere changed completely as the elevator doors opened on the ICU floor. Gone was the quiet lobby, replaced by the controlled chaos of beeping monitors, rushing footsteps, and the low murmur of urgent conversations. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency between rooms, and the smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the air. Richard's confident stride faltered slightly as the reality of why he was here came crashing back. His son Leo, his 8-year-old boy, was somewhere in this maze of medical equipment and critical care rooms. Richard had been in Seattle when he got the call from his wife, Clara. He was closing a business deal worth millions when his phone rang with the news that Leo had been rushed to the hospital with a rare respiratory failure. He had caught the first flight out, but the storm had delayed everything. The 3-hour trip had taken nearly 6, and every minute felt like an eternity. Now, finally here, he felt the fear he had been suppressing with anger and control begin to surface. He found the VIP room at the end of the hall, a private suite that his donations had helped fund. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit with monitors glowing softly in the darkness. His wife Clara sat in a chair beside the bed, her eyes red and puffy from crying, her designer clothes wrinkled from hours of worry. On the bed lay Leo, looking impossibly small and fragile against the white sheets. But he was breathing, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, no tubes or masks covering his face. "Clara, how is he?" "I came as fast as I could. The traffic in the city is absolutely insane," Richard said, rushing to her side. Clara looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, but there was relief in her eyes, a kind of overwhelming gratitude that made her whole body shake. "He's alive, Richard. He's going to be okay." "It was a miracle, an absolute miracle," she whispered, reaching out to take her husband's hand. Before Richard could respond, the door opened again and Dr. Marcus Evans entered, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that comes from decades in emergency medicine. "Mr. Sterling, I'm glad you made it," Dr. Evans said, moving to check the monitors beside Leo's bed. "We had a very serious complication early this morning. The mechanical ventilator failed due to a power surge during the storm. The backup generator took approximately 30 seconds to kick in, but in that time, Leo stopped breathing." The color drained from Richard's face, his knees felt weak and he gripped the bedrail to steady himself. "What? How did this happen?" "I'm going to sue the equipment manufacturers. Where was your staff? How could you let this happen to my son?" he demanded, his voice rising with each word. Dr. Evans held up a hand, his expression serious but calm. "Mr. Sterling, please understand that we had an unprecedented situation. There was a massive pileup on Highway 94 due to the blizzard. We had multiple trauma cases flooding in simultaneously, and most of our ICU staff was pulled to help with the emergency. The storm also knocked out power to several sections of the hospital. It was chaos." "I don't care about your excuses," Richard shouted, but Clara squeezed his hand hard, silencing him. "Richard, listen," she said firmly. "There was a nurse. He refused to leave Leo's side. When the ventilator failed, he didn't panic. He didn't run to get help and leave our baby alone. He stayed." Her voice broke with emotion as she continued. "For 6 straight hours, Richard, 6 hours. He manually pumped oxygen into Leo's lungs with that bag thing, the resuscitator. Dr. Evans said he didn't stop, not even for water. His hands were cramping so badly by the end that they were shaking, but he kept going until the machine was fixed and Leo was stable." Richard stared at his wife, then at his son, then at the doctor, trying to process what he was hearing. The anger that had fueled him for the past several hours began to dissolve, replaced by a crushing wave of gratitude and disbelief. "Who was it?" Richard asked quietly. "I want to reward him. I want to double his salary, give him a bonus, whatever it takes. Where is he now?" Dr. Evans consulted his tablet, scrolling through the shift logs. "He just clocked out about 20 minutes ago. His name is Alex, one of our best ICU nurses. He worked a double shift, actually a 36-hour shift, because the storm prevented the next shift from coming in. He was utterly exhausted by the end. I believe he mentioned something about resting in the lobby before driving home because he was feeling too dizzy and didn't trust himself behind the wheel in this weather." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and a high-pitched ringing filled his ears. His vision tunneled, focusing on nothing as the horrible realization crashed over him in waves. The lobby, Alex, the nurse he had just fired and humiliated. The man sleeping on the bench wasn't lazy or incompetent. He was a hero who had just spent 6 hours manually keeping Richard's son alive, and Richard had kicked him out into a blizzard. "Did you say the lobby?" Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes, why? Is something wrong?" Dr. Evans asked, noticing the sudden change in Richard's demeanor. "Alex," Richard repeated, the name now carrying a weight that made it hard to breathe. "What have I done? Oh God, what have I done?" Without waiting for a response, Richard turned and ran from the room. He sprinted down the hallway, ignoring the startled looks from nurses and other hospital staff. He bypassed the elevator and threw himself into the stairwell, taking the steps 2 and 3 at a time, his expensive shoes slipping on the smooth concrete. His heart pounded in his chest, not from exertion but from the crushing guilt that threatened to suffocate him. He burst through the door into the main lobby, his eyes immediately going to the bench where he had found Alex sleeping. It was empty. Panic seized him as he ran to the security desk where one of the guards who had escorted Alex out was sitting. "The nurse, the one I told you to remove, where did he go?" Richard demanded, slamming his hands on the desk. The security guard looked up, startled. "He's gone, sir. You told us to escort him out, so we did. Last I saw, he was at the bus stop outside, waiting for the next route." Richard didn't wait to hear more. He ran toward the exit, pushing through the heavy doors into the freezing Minneapolis night. The snow was coming down harder now, thick flakes that immediately clung to his suit and melted against his skin. The cold bit through his expensive clothes like they were nothing, but he barely noticed. His eyes scanned the area frantically until he spotted a figure hunched on the bench at the bus stop, shoulders drawn up against the cold, head bowed. Nurse Alex. Richard shouted, his voice nearly lost in the wind. The figure looked up, and even through the falling snow, Richard could see the confusion and wariness in Alex's eyes. The nurse had been expecting another bus, not the man who had just destroyed his career. Richard ran to him, and in a moment that would have been unthinkable an hour ago, he dropped to his knees in the slush and snow in front of the bench, ruining his $5,000 suit without a second thought. "I didn't know," Richard said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Please, God, please forgive me. I didn't know what you had done. You saved my son. You saved Leo." Alex stared at him for a long moment, his exhausted brain trying to make sense of this bizarre turn of events. Then slowly, a tired smile spread across his face. "Leo stable then?" he asked, and there was genuine relief in his voice. "Yes, thanks to you, and I fired you. I humiliated you. I called you lazy and had you thrown out into a blizzard," Richard said, tears now mixing with the melting snow on his face. "I am so sorry." Alex was quiet for a moment, looking down at the man kneeling before him in the snow. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, without a trace of anger or bitterness. "Mr. Sterling, we don't do this job for recognition. We certainly don't do it for the money, that's for sure. We do it because when we're standing next to that bed, that's not just a patient hooked up to machines. That's somebody's child, somebody's parent, somebody's entire world. Tonight, that little boy was your world, and I did what any nurse would do. I did what I was trained to do, what I took an oath to do." Richard looked up at him, this young man who had every right to be furious, who had just been treated with contempt and cruelty, yet showed nothing but compassion and grace. "You're hired back effective immediately, with a raise, a significant raise, and I want to personally fund a new ICU nurse training program in your name. Please just come back inside, you're going to freeze out here." Alex's smile widened slightly. "I appreciate that, Mr. Sterling, I really do, but right now I need to know that you understand something. The nurses in there, the ones still working while I'm sitting here, they're doing the same thing I did. They're fighting for every patient like they're fighting for their own family. They work double shifts, they skip meals, they push through exhaustion because lives depend on it. If you really want to honor what happened tonight, don't just help me, help all of them." Richard nodded vigorously, pulling out his phone despite his shaking hands. "I will, I promise you I will, but first please come back inside, let me make this right." And before we continue, if you're watching this on Money Stories That Matter, please hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is dedicated to stories that teach us powerful lessons about money, success, and what truly matters in life. We share these stories because they change perspectives, and we want to make sure you never miss one. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're always part of our community. Alex finally stood up, his legs unsteady after the long shift in the cold, and allowed Richard to help him back toward the hospital entrance. As they walked through the doors into the warmth, Richard kept his hand on Alex's shoulder, as if afraid the nurse might disappear if he let go. They went directly to the administrative offices, where Richard demanded to see the hospital director despite the late hour. Within 30 minutes, Alex's firing was reversed, his record cleared, and a formal apology issued. But Richard didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, as Leo recovered fully and was discharged home, Richard became a man on a mission. He established the Nurse Alex Foundation for ICU Nurses, named after Alex, with an initial endowment of $5 million. The foundation provided scholarships for nursing students, mental health resources for working nurses, and grants for hospitals to improve their ICU equipment and staffing levels. He funded a lounge renovation at Minneapolis General, creating a comfortable space where nurses could actually rest during their breaks instead of catching sleep on lobby benches. Richard also did something else, something that surprised everyone who knew him. He started volunteering at the hospital, not in an administrative capacity but in simple ways. He delivered meals to patients, he sat with elderly people who had no visitors, he read stories to children in the pediatric ward. He wanted to understand, really understand, the world that Alex and nurses like him inhabited every single day. 6 months after that snowy night, the hospital held a ceremony to unveil a new wing funded entirely by Richard's donations. The Richard and Clara Sterling Family ICU wing was state-of-the-art, with backup systems for every critical piece of equipment, private rooms for families, and dedicated rest areas for staff. But the plaque outside didn't just bear the Sterling name. Right beneath it in equal-sized letters it read, "In honor of Nurse Alex and all ICU nurses, the silent guardians of life." At the ceremony, Richard stood at the podium looking out at the crowd of hospital staff, donors, and media. Alex stood off to the side, uncomfortable with the attention but present at Clara's insistence. Leo, now healthy and energetic, sat in the front row between his parents' empty seats. 6 months ago, I learned the hardest lesson of my life. Richard began, his voice steady but emotional. I learned that the things we can see, the plaques on walls, the names on buildings, the expensive suits and fancy titles, none of that matters when a life hangs in the balance. What matters are the people willing to stand in the gap, to give everything they have, to fight for someone else's tomorrow even when they're running on empty themselves. He paused, looking directly at Alex. I almost lost my son twice that night, once to equipment failure and once to my own arrogance and ignorance. A man I had never met saved Leo the first time by refusing to give up, by staying when he could have left, by pushing his body beyond what anyone should have to endure. And I repaid him by treating him like he was worthless. I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that moment, trying to ensure that no nurse, no healthcare worker is ever treated the way I treated Alex. The audience applauded, but Richard held up his hand. But here's what I really want everyone watching this to understand, because I know this story is going to be shared beyond this room. We live in a world where we judge people constantly. We judge them by what we see in a single moment without knowing their story, without understanding what battles they've just fought or what mountains they've just climbed. That person you see sleeping in public might not be lazy. They might be a hero who just saved a life. That person who seems rude or short with you might be dealing with tragedy you can't imagine. That worker you think isn't trying hard enough might be pushing through circumstances you've never had to face. He stepped away from the podium and walked over to Alex, extending his hand, but Alex didn't shake it. Instead, he pulled Richard into a brief hug and the audience erupted in applause. As they separated, Richard turned back to the crowd with tears in his eyes. Judge less, ask more. Understand that everyone you meet is carrying a burden you know nothing about, and if you have the power to make someone's load lighter, do it. Don't wait until you find out they're a hero. Do it because they're human, and that should be enough. The ceremony ended with a tour of the new facilities, and as people filtered through the gleaming hallways, Richard found himself standing alone with Alex in one of the new nurses' lounges. The room was comfortable, with real beds, a kitchenette, and even a window with a view of the city. Thank you for this, Alex said quietly. Not just for me, but for everyone who works here. You have no idea how much this means. I think I'm starting to understand, Richard replied. Clara told me you turned down the position of ICU director that we offered you. Can I ask why? Alex smiled. Because I'm not a director, I'm a nurse. That's where I belong, next to the patients doing the work. Let someone else handle the administration. I just want to help people. Richard shook his head in wonder. You're a better man than I am, Alex, but I'm trying to learn. Leo asks about you all the time, you know. He wants to be a nurse when he grows up now. Says he wants to save people like you saved him. Tell him he can be anything he wants, Alex said. But if he does choose nursing, tell him to do it because he can't imagine doing anything else, not because he feels obligated. It's a calling, not a career. As Richard left the hospital that evening, walking past the lobby where this whole journey had begun, he paused. He looked at the bench where he had found Alex sleeping, where his ignorance and arrogance had almost cost him the chance to know one of the best people he had ever met. He made a silent promise to himself and to every healthcare worker who would ever pass through these doors that he would never forget the lesson learned on that snowy night. Now I want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever judged someone based on appearances only to discover you were completely wrong? Have you ever been on the receiving end of that kind of judgment? Share your stories because these conversations matter. They remind us all to be more compassionate, more understanding, more human. The story of Richard Sterling and nurse Alex spread far beyond Minneapolis. News outlets picked it up, then social media, then it became one of those stories people share when they want to remind the world that kindness and humility matter. The Nurse Alex Foundation grew, expanding to hospitals across the country, improving conditions for nurses and healthcare workers everywhere. Richard became a different kind of philanthropist, one who didn't just write checks but who understood the human cost behind every dollar donated. And Alex, he continued to do what he had always done. He showed up for his shifts, he cared for his patients with the same dedication that had saved Leo's life, and he trained new nurses to see every patient as someone's whole world. He never sought fame or recognition, but he accepted the role his story played in changing how people viewed healthcare workers. When reporters asked him what he wanted people to take away from his experience, his answer was always the same. Remember that healthcare workers are human beings who sacrifice more than you can imagine to be there for you on your worst days. Treat them with respect, support them. And understand that when you see someone who looks exhausted or worn down, you might be looking at someone who just saved a life, maybe several lives. Don't judge, don't assume, just be kind. Years later, when Leo Sterling graduated from nursing school at the top of his class, Nurse Alex was there in the audience, applauding alongside Richard and Clara. The boy who had been saved by an exhausted nurse in a snowstorm had become a young man dedicated to saving others. As Leo crossed the stage to receive his degree, he looked out at the crowd and saw Alex smiling at him, and in that moment the circle was complete. The final lesson of this story isn't just about not judging people by appearances or single moments. It's about the ripple effects of our actions, both negative and positive. Richard's cruelty could have ended Nurse Alex's career, could have deprived countless future patients of an exceptional nurse. But his willingness to recognize his mistake, to genuinely change and make amends, created waves of positive change that touched thousands of lives. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the people you encounter every day, then do me a favor. Subscribe to Money Stories That Matter if you haven't already, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us how this story impacted you. These aren't just stories, they're lessons in humanity, wrapped in narratives that stick with us long after we've finished watching. Remember Richard Sterling the next time you're tempted to judge someone harshly without knowing their story. Remember Nurse Alex when you wonder if your work matters or if anyone notices your sacrifices. Remember Leo Sterling when you think about how the actions of today shape the people of tomorrow. And remember that in every interaction you have a choice, to tear someone down or build them up, to judge or to understand, to be part of the problem or part of the solution. The next time you see someone sleeping in a public place, someone who looks disheveled or exhausted, someone who doesn't meet your standards of how they should present themselves, pause. Take a breath. Consider that you might be looking at a hero who just fought a battle you'll never see. Consider that your words and actions have power, the power to hurt or heal, to destroy or uplift. Choose wisely, because you never know when the person in front of you might be the one who saved a life, maybe even a life that matters to you more than anything else in the world.